Welcome to Jewish Wisdom on JTV, the global Jewish channel. Well, it's not the beginning of a joke, but we're joined by a rabbi and a Catholic, Professor Peter Tyler from St. Mary's University, and Rabbi Joseph Dweck joins us back again. And I thought it'd be really interesting to have a discussion of some interesting points of potential disagreement, theological disagreement between Jews and Christians, or more specifically Catholics. Let's begin with a question that I started thinking about when I was growing up. I remember I was learning about Christianity, and there was a particular line in the New Testament that really sort of stuck with me, made me think, which was the concept of loving your enemy. And you sort of think, on the one hand, well, it sort of does make sense in the sense that you want to fight hate with love, and that's the only way that you can kind of make the world a better place. But at the same time, it seems kind of a bit silly. Like, if you're going to love your enemy, then you're never going to... First of all, you need to have specific boundaries. You need to appreciate who is who. But similarly, you need to know who you're dealing with, and you need to have boundaries put in place. So, Professor Tyler, do you want to start off by kind of addressing the Christian view on this?
Well, you look at your enemy and you think, well, the enemy is the person I actually hate. They're awful. But as someone once said, your enemy is your greatest teacher. Because your enemy is often the parts of yourself. I'm also a psychologist. And what one sees in psychology is the parts of yourself that you don't accept, you project onto the enemy. So when you had the massacre in Orlando, for example, a few weeks ago, we found out later that the fella actually went to the gay club. And what you'll find is, for example, a lot of homophobic hatred is people who are not comfortable with their own sexuality. So often when we are projecting onto others what we don't like, they become our enemies, and then it becomes a vicious circle.
Right. Rabbi Dweck, there just seems to be something inherently naive about this idea of loving your enemy. I think about ISIS. So do I want to love ISIS? How does this work? What is the Jewish perception of how we can frame this?
Well, I think that there are probably three levels that we could discuss this on as far as Judaism, the approach to Judaism on this. If we look at the Old Testament, or we look at the Torah, the oyev, which is the Hebrew word for enemy, is always someone that is out to hurt or destroy you. And so there is a concept that the Chachamim, that the rabbis in the Talmud brought out, where they say, Hakam nehorga chashkem nehorgo, which is a very aggressive idea, and where if you know that somebody is getting up to kill you, you preempt. You do not simply lie back and allow for somebody to diminish your life. And so that's a core concept in Judaism, and where the highest aspect of achievement in Judaism is the achievement of the fulfillment of oneself.
Not the other?
The other only in terms of being able to love and relate. But if you don't have a self that's present, there's no love and there's no relationship.
Right.
So the boundaries of self are essential, and to recognize the threats to those boundaries are essential, because if those boundaries are breached, then there is no self left. So enemy is a very serious question as far as Torah is concerned. And what we find, for example, in the book of Shemot, in the book of Exodus, is that it says, if you find your enemy's donkey struggling under the weight of what it's bearing, help them out. That's about as far as it goes. And even that is a question as to which enemy are we talking about. Are you talking about an enemy that is among your people in the sense that they are acting in ways that is counterproductive to the nation as a whole? Or are we talking about enemies that are genuinely out to get you? And the Chachamim actually differentiate between the two. And they say, if you know that it's an enemy that's genuinely out to destroy you or to diminish your life, that's not what the Pasuk is talking about. The other level that we can look at it as is in terms of, we don't necessarily say to love the enemy actively, because we're very concerned about your loving something that is not prepared to love you back. We're very concerned about loving something that will cause you to diminish yourself in the act of what would be deemed as perhaps love, but not necessarily true love, because there's no self really there to love.
Such as?
Where you would be doing such a thing. So if you're engaged in a relationship where you know that the relationship is abusive, for example,
right,
Right? There is no commandment to engage in that relationship and to turn the other cheek, as one might say, and allow for that abuse to occur.
There's no commandment to love them, love the abuser.
There is no aspect of loving the abuser in the sense that, in a way that would require you to diminish yourself in doing so. We'll talk about. So that's the second level. So there's an issue where there's a line in Proverbs in Mishle, and where it says, "Bin pol oyivcha al tismach," right? Which means that when you see your enemy falling, don't be happy. So that's a very different perspective on it. It doesn't say, love the enemy. What it says is you shouldn't be rejoicing when you see elements of this world that are failing even if they did you wrong. And so there's a lot that's discussed with regards to that in terms of going out of Egypt and seeing the Egyptians drown and so on, where for this reason we will not praise God fully during Passover because of that issue, that it shouldn't be confused as praising him for causing enemies to
Right.
But ultimately, there is a concept in where if I'm looking at things very cosmically, I'm looking at things in terms of the broadness of creation, do I find value in the concept of enemy? Yes. We find value in the concept of enemy because it's an antagonist. It's something that causes us to build our own boundaries, to sense our own self, to question where do I begin and end, and what do I fight for in terms of myself. But that's about as far as
that's as far as we're prepared to go. So the key difference that I've found, that I seem to have found between you two, is that you're basically saying some relationships cannot be reconciled. Yeah. Yes, I can gain some things from the abuser, from the enemy.
I learned something.
But I can learn some things. But I can't develop a loving relationship. Whereas you seem to be saying, no, we should sort of strive for, in every single circumstance, to build a loving relationship. Without becoming a doormat. So how would that work?
I mean, as someone, as a good example of an abusive relationship, I don't think the Christian message would be you should just lie back and let it get on.
So what would
There's this question of justice as well. And we have in the Christian tradition what's called the just war tradition, certainly in the Catholic tradition. And if people are being harmed to a certain extent, then there is the possibility of fighting back.
But with still this hope that you can love them, with an aim to love them as well?
Absolutely, because there are, I think as the Rabbi was saying, there are sort of moral limits. I mean, Hitler is a good example. If Hitler is doing certain acts, do we just let him do it? I mean, this is where, I talked about the Gandhi thing before. That's where I think the Gandhi thing falls down. If Gandhi had been in England, it would have been, well, let's just let Hitler invade. Whereas, well, not quite as simple as that. Whereas what happened, and my father was one of them, and he was a Catholic, and he decided it was important to fight against Hitler.
I appreciate,
and that was permissible under Catholic.
Right. So I appreciate whether it's Nazi Germany, whether it's an abuser, you don't want to be a doormat. But I think the question really comes back to what I was saying before. Can we, in our heart of hearts, say that deep down we love them, or we want to love them, we want to love the abuser, we want to love Hitler? Are you saying yes, that's the case?
We have a statement: love the sinner, but hate the sin.
So you're saying we should love Hitler?
Absolutely, but hate the sin.
But hate his ideology.
Yes.
Rabbi, that's really a fascinating worldview. What's your take on this?
Well, the question is how to angle it. There is no question that as far as Torah is concerned, there is appropriate hatred. There are times where it is appropriate to hate. So there's a pasuk, Misana'acha Adonai Yisna. The things that you hate, God, I hate. So first of all, that assumes that God hates something, right? First of all, which is, definitely, I don't know that it crossovers into Christian doctrine. And that is that if I recognize that God is hating something, and in the sense that that this is antithetical to life, to sharing, to development, to production. Yeah. What would God hate? That's perhaps a question more in terms of understanding what we see God as being. And so these are all intertwined issues. But we would deem that to be something that is counterproductive and antithetical to life, to kindness, to development.
But what about to interrupt? So God can hate then?
Yes. In the sense that, well, look, God doesn't have emotions. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So obviously we're borrowing these terms for our perspectives. Mm-hmm. There is no word in Hebrew for like, right? There's love and there is hate. Mm-hmm. And it's important to understand that as far as Torah is concerned, love is not primarily an emotion. I think a lot of people mistake that. They think that love is foremost how I feel. Love is not primarily an emotion. Love is a verb. It's an action. It is what you pay attention to, what you make efforts to care for, whether you like the person or not, or like the entity or not per se, right? It could be that you have somebody in your family that you love very much but don't particularly like, but you understand that you will make efforts to pay attention to them, to care for their welfare, to engage in protecting them and so on. You expand your boundaries in order to be able to bring them into your place and space. That's what we look at as being love. So to do that for an enemy is extremely dangerous.
So I can understand this concept that we should hate selfishness, we should hate a lack of kindness. But what about what Professor Tyler just said a second ago, the actual person? Rabbi, can we separate hating the sin and the sinner? Can we separate hating Nazism and Hitler, the man himself?
Well, I don't think it's as black and white as that. But yes, there is definitely discussion in the Talmud that differentiates between the sin and the sinner. So it's actually a story with Rabbi Meir and his wife Bruria, where Rabbi Meir is really upset with these neighbors that he has that are just, awful people. And he's praying for them, for their demise. And his wife says to him, it says, Yamutu hata'im mina aretz, right? Let the sins fall from the land, but not necessarily the sinners. What we want is for the sinners to be able to see a betterment, to be able to improve. That's our ultimate goal. But it does happen that a human being ends up giving oneself over completely to darkness. And Hitler is an example where we would not look at that man and say we can find somewhere to love him. That man gave himself over to darkness and evil. And when it becomes a situation where a person is almost synonymous with evil and the sin and destruction and death and suffering and so on and so forth, it becomes very difficult to differentiate the two.
Professor, I mean, are there people that become irredeemably bad that are we're no longer able to show affection for them?
I know you said at the beginning that we weren't going to go into deep theological issues, but I think
It's hard not to.
I think it does.
What I mean is we're not going to. I know we're not going to go into the Trinity and Jesus and all these things.
But I think
it's concepts of God and it's concepts of how the world works.
But I think it hinges on the concept of evil, really.
Yeah.
And this is a problem for Christianity. I teach my undergraduates. They all want to do essays on evil. That's all they're interested in. And it's a big problem for Christianity, because the classical solution, I mentioned just war theory, which is from Thomas Aquinas. Thomas Aquinas' classical solution is that evil is an absence of good. So for Aquinas, evil doesn't really exist. It's a non-existing entity. And that's not very satisfactory. As you say, when you're faced with the horrors of the Holocaust or any other, these horrible massacres we've had, I mean, you can't say that it's just not existing. And so my theology students tie themselves in knots on this one. And there's a lot of empathy for the Jewish position there. So I was asking you the question, can God hate? I mean, what you've got, I think, in Judaism is a more psychologically rounded sense of God in some respects. Because it's very difficult not to hate.
Well, this is the ultimate question I'm dealing with. On the one hand, we want to sort of be airy-fairy, lovers of everything, but on the other hand, there really is darkness in this world, and we have to be real about these things.